In yesterday's video, we talked about mage builds. Today, we're talking about mage builds again, but we're looking at those who have more specific builds and don't work too well with the standard builds or have certain aspects in there that make it important to talk about them individually. So, before we get started, if you haven't watched the first part and want more of a general idea of how to build mages, please go back to the first part, which will be linked right here. This one is more for specific AA mages and stuff like that. Also, once again, thanks and shout out to Trelly Rally and Warfire X. Trelly Rally's YouTube is also linked down below. Both of them are high level ranked players and both of them helped me with these builds and checked back on whatever I could improve on them. With that, let's get into the builds. The first one we're talking about here is Anubis. Anubis is a little bit off the norm simply because he's one of the few mages who can make use of Spear of the Magus. This is because he has a protection steal. Obsidian Shard does not work all too well with protection reduction, as many of you may know already, and as such, Spear of the Magus becomes a much better choice, simply because you can reduce the protection of your enemy by so much so quickly, especially early in the game. At the same time, he also benefits more from lifesteal due to the increase with his passive, so at least one lifesteal item should be in his build. The build I will show you here is Soulstone, Banecroft's Talon, Shoes of the Magi, Spear of the Magus, Gem of Isolation, Rod of Tahuti, and Spear of Desolation. This is not nearly all that can be built on Anubis. This is just one of many options. This one allows you to keep a little bit more of a distance with additional slows. His damage will be good regardless, and at the same time this one will work off the flat penetration so you can really burst down squishies. You can go for other options, especially Gem of Isolation and Spear of Desolation can easily be replaced. You can, for example, go for more lifesteal. You can even stack Warlock Sash on him for extra survivability. There are many options here. You can also work with Dynasty Playtime and stuff like that, but I would recommend going into Tiny Trinket and lifesteal early on, simply because he makes so much use of it. Really, Anubis is very flexible overall, but this build should work among many others for him. In the very late game, you can always consider ditching the Spear of the Magus in favor of an Obsidian Shard anyways, if the enemy team is building high magical defense. The next god is Ao Kuang. Now, Ao Kuang is usually played in the jungle, and I have made a jungle video, but as he wasn't an assassin or isn't an assassin, I did not include him in that video, therefore he's coming in here with the mages. So with Ao Kuang, I would not recommend taking him into middle lane. There is a bit of a potential to play him solo lane, but it's very low as well at the moment. So I would just say take him into jungle, and for that I would recommend this build. Bamba's Mask, Dynasty Plate-Helm, Shoes of the Magi, Polynomicon, Obsidian Shard, Rod of Tahuti, Soul Reaver. And if you need Winged Blade, I will point this out as a situational. You will often need it on him, so I'm throwing this in as a situational. You could, for example, replace Soul Reaver with it. Late game, if you really don't need Dynasty Plate-Helm, you can also replace that with Spear of Desolation if you get a ridiculous amount of gold by any chance, but most of the time the game won't even go that long. The reason for Dynasty Plate-Helm early is because it allows you to keep up with physical jungles much better in terms of trading. Ao Kuang's early isn't the strongest, and by having physical defense, you will be able to survive much better against them. The rest of the build is pretty self-explanatory. He is just looking to basically one-shot people and get out, therefore you're looking for the burst from Polynomicon, the burst from Soul Reaver if you can, the burst from Rod of Tahuti, the burst from Obsidian Shard, like all that extra damage. And that's literally all there is to his kit, so the build on him is usually very damage focused, with sometimes one defensive situational. The next two gods share a build, and some others will have this similar build as well. Now these are healers, Aphrodite and Chang'e. Before we even talk about these builds, let me point out that these are not nearly all the builds that can be done on healers. Healers are very flexible, you can build them more damage focused, more utility focused, however you like really, and they can function in different ways. These builds that I'm showing you here are those that will allow you to survive relatively well and also help your team a lot with extra healing and stuff like that. The build I am proposing here is Soulstone, still to have that early extra damage. It's just better for healers to not get Vamp Shroud most of the time in my opinion, simply because they can self-heal anyways. Dynasty Plate-Helm for that early tankiness, because they're also kind of gankable, don't really have escapes. Shoes of Focus if you like them, simply because they give you more cooldown reduction in order to get your heal off more often, but you can also go for Shoes of the Magi if you want more damage, more penetration. Rod of Asclepius for that extra healing and extra movement speed and extra health. Really, really helpful for those low mobility guards with healing. Obsidian Shard to still get some damage off. Rod of Tahuti to increase your scalings overall. And I'm finishing this off with the Gem of Isolation. Gem of Isolation doesn't have to be built. I think it complements the build overall very well because you already have Dynasty Playtime and a Rod of Asclepius, so you have some physical defense, you have some health, now you're getting some more health. It makes you relatively tanky, and it helps Chang'e and Aphrodite especially because they don't really have too many means of keeping enemies away. Yes, they have hard CC either in the Kiss or the Ultimate, but they don't have the same zoning tools or escape tools as others. And slowing the enemy with every ability you do is very, very helpful for them because it really allows them to poke longer and heal themselves up. It can also be built earlier in the build, obviously, with that same function, or you can just leave it out completely and go for something else. With that same logic, I'd like to skip ahead a little bit and address Hel and Ra. Now, generally, I would recommend the same build on those as well if you're looking for that healing and utility. There is a bit of a difference when it comes to Hel. As on her, I really wouldn't recommend Gem of Isolation. Gem of Isolation doesn't make too much sense for her because she has to get close to get all her damage off anyways, and she kind of isn't looking for that ranged ability to slow an enemy down and then keep on poking them, most of the time at least, but rather she is looking for that heavy burst in team fights. You can really build her full damage if you want to, but then again, she's not too much any meta anyways. What I would recommend instead on her is Lotus Crown. Lotus Crown will allow you to heal a mid-team fight, and while the heal will usually be reduced, by various effects, it will still allow you to give more protections for your team. Lotus Crown is kind of not that highly rated at the moment by most players, but I think for Hel, it can really work better than for others, simply because she can use her heal relatively often and can just apply it that way whenever it's needed. With Ra, I do propose the same build here in terms of utility, but I think Ra is a little more viable with a little more damagey focused options than the other mages here, the other healers here rather. Gem of Isolation, I threw that in there because you can build it if you want to. If you want that extra utility for your team, you can build it on Ra, but he doesn't really have those easily confirmable abilities that make it that logical most of the time, unless you want to use your 3 to slow the enemies. And instead, you can often opt for more damage focused options in the last slot as well, and they will help you more. But that really depends on you, your playstyle, and how the game's going. Just throwing this out there. And with that, we're coming to the last group of gods who kinda all work off basic attacks more or less. Let's start with Kronos. On Kronos, I think you can still start Soulstone. It's simply the better item for clear early, and his early clear isn't that great. He also has relatively safe clear despite of it not being that good, so why not? Then you go for your early game item of choice, which will often be Dynasty Playtime, just to have a little more survivability. Shoes of the Magi for the extra penetration. And with Kronos, this is actually the only god where I put Winged Blade in the core build. Yes, you can build Telekine's Ring as well instead if you want attack speed, but I feel like Winged Blade just helps him so much, simply because he's already very fast, and this is just that little extra speed that allows him to close up to enemies and stick to them with his free built-in haste and fatalis. And most of the time there will be at least one slow, which in my opinion makes it worth it. It doesn't have to be built though, but once again, I would generally recommend it over Telekine's Ring. Next item, Obsidian Shard. You still want that penetration, and you're getting Obsidian Shard here because Kronos has a really good structure push, and that just amplifies it, whilst Demonic Grip wouldn't do the same thing. Rod of Tahuti to get some extra damage, and as a last slot, I would probably get Polynomicon here, in order to amplify your hits even more. At that point you will be hitting very, very hard, and he makes very good use of high power, so Polynomicon works in his favor here. By the same logic, stacking on Kronos can also be very good. Doom Orb or Book of Thoth can both help him snowball really hard, but you have to know if you can risk that. The next AA god is very different because it's Freya. Freya also starts with Soulstone, and there's pretty much no debate about that. It works very, very well for her amplified abilities with that Soulstone. She then has the option to either go for Shoes of the Magi first, but what most people do first is Haste and Fatalis, simply to get that sticking power early, and then Shoes of the Magi to get some more oomph behind her basic attacks. The next item for her should be Demonic Grip. Demonic Grip is stronger than Spear of the Magus at this point of the game, surprisingly, against pretty much all targets. Didn't expect that myself, thanks to Warfryer for pointing that out. And what you want to do here is get that extra attack speed and also the protection reduction against your targets, allowing her to get a lot more of her base damage off. The next item after that in this particular build is Spear of the Magus. Spear of the Magus once again gets the protection even lower, and due to Freya's unique basic attacks, with her 2-up or her 1-up, you can actually stack Demonic Grip and Spear of the Magus at the same time, so it's very, very effective. You can also go Wingblade instead if you want some more survivability, or if you're looking to trade an ADC, you can also go for Witchblade, but I really like Spear for that extra damage. The item after that could be Rod of the Hoodie here, simply to get some higher damage, and I would finish the whole thing off with Pythagorean's Piece in order to get some extra CDR, some extra lifesteal, some extra overall trading potential for her. CDR is really nice because it allows her to get her kit up again and sooner and use that whole ability rotation again. The next basic attack god is much less of one, but he is still a little bit of one, and that is Poseidon. So Poseidon typically starts with a very ability burst focused build. Soulstone into Dynasty Playtime, into Shoes of the Magi, into Gem of Isolation. Nothing too special here. Gem of Isolation is very, very strong on Poseidon, simply because it allows him to slow with his pool, pulling the enemies in even more, kind of forcing them into Winged Blade or Sprint, without actually having a slow on that ability. Then Obsidian Shard and Rod of the Hoodie. So all standard so far. The last item, though, could be Hasten Fatalis. Now, I think at this point of the game, you usually have enough damage. You're usually loaded up with damage against your enemies in terms of abilities. You can also go Poly here, obviously, but with his 2, I feel like Fatalis really still has a lot of potential on Poseidon and allows him to transition a little better into late game, as he's not only focused on the burst that he has, but also has some basic attacks after that will deal a lot of damage to the enemy too, and it's often very underrated. So that is only for the last slot in my opinion, but for that it can still be good. And that brings us to the last basic attack god, the last basic attack mage rather. Sol. Sol, I would start with Soulstone, simply because it gives her a better clear and she's relatively safe anyways. Dynasty Playtime, so you don't get ganked too hard. Shoes of the Magi for the extra pen, and then it's a little different. We got Telekine's Ring in the next slot to give her extra attack speed in order to get more basics off, which hit really hard. And then you can go into Obsidian Shard if you want Structure Push. There is also the possibility on her to go for Demonic Grip if you're really looking for more basics, but I feel like most of the time a lot of the burst is coming from your 2 before you even getting the basics off, and you slow the enemy down and then follow with your abilities. Also, it helps your ultimate a lot more, and like I said, the Structure Push. So overall, I prefer Obsidian Shard. Then you can go Polynomicon if you're able to confirm your basics reliably. It will give you more burst, and it's kind of cheap, and it gives you some more sustain. If you're not that confident with hitting your basics, then go for Rod of the Hoodie first. It will give you more overall DPS in a longer fight. And if you go for Rod of the Hoodie first, then go for Polynomicon after, otherwise the other way around. And last but not least, it's also worth pointing out that Winged Blade can be a very good situational item for her, replacing the Telekine's Ring if you have enough damage late game. Yes, she does get some slow immunity in her kit, but really, as her escape is kind of a bit of a delayed one, it really isn't all that great at all times in late game. And Winged Blade can make up for that, whereas the Hasten Fatalis doesn't really make sense on her due to her 3 working in that way as well. That's it for the second part of the mage build. Obviously, by far not all mage builds that can be done, but I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope this gives you a basic idea of how you can build the gods. If you have the feeling that you'd like to branch out from these builds, I would totally advise you to do so. There are many, many more options out there that have never been experimented with, and I think this is just a tip of the iceberg, just giving you a rough idea of which builds can work decently and you won't struggle because of your build. And then from there on, you can progress into your own unique builds where you figure out how things work 10 times better. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you for the next video tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.